Chapter 10. Early the following morning, Stewart, with a company of cowboys, departed for Don Carlos Ranch. As the day wore on without any report from him, Stillwell appeared to grow more at ease, and at nightfall he told Madeline that he had guessed there was no reason now for concern.
"Well, though it sure is amazingly strange. I've been worrying some about how we were going to fire Don Carlos, but Gene has a way of doing things."
Next day, Stillwell and Alfred decided to ride over to Don Carlos' place, taking Madeline and Florence with them, and upon the return trip to stop at Alfred's ranch. They started in the cool gray dawn, and after 3 hours of riding, as the sun began to get bright, they entered a mesquite grove surrounding corrals and barns in a number of low, squat buildings and a huge, rambling structure, all built of adobe and mostly crumbling to ruin. Only one green spot revealed the bald red of grounds and walls. This, evidently, was made by the spring which had given both value and fame to Don Carlos Range. The approach to the house was through a wide courtyard, bare, stony, hard-packed, with hitching rails and watering troughs in front of a long porch. Several dusty and tired horses stood with drooping heads and bridles down, their wet flanks attesting to traveling that just ended.
"Well, doggone it, Al, if that ain't Pat Hawes' hoss, I'll eat it," exclaimed Stillwell.
"What's Pat want here, anyhow?" growled Alfred. No one was in sight, but Madeline heard loud voices coming from the house. Stillwell dismounted at the porch and stalked in at the door. Alfred leapt off his horse and helped Florence and Madeline down. Bidding them rest and wait on the porch, he followed Stillwell.
"I hate these greaser places," said Florence with a grimace. "They're always so mysterious and creepy. Just watch now. They'll be dark-skinned and beady-eyed, soft-footed greasers slip right up out of the ground. There'll be an ugly face in every door and winder and crack." "It's like a huge barn with its characteristic odors that permeate with tobacco smoke," replied Madeline, sitting down beside Florence. "I don't think very much of this end of my purchase. Florence, isn't that Don Carlos' black horse over there in the corral?" "It sure is. Then the Don's here yet. I wish we hadn't been in such a hurry to come over. There, that doesn't sound encouraging."
From the corridor came the rattling of spurs, tramping of boots, and loud voices. Madeline detected Alfred's quick note when he was annoyed. "We'll rustle home back, then," he said. The answer came, "No." Madeline recognized Stewart's voice, and she quickly straightened up. "I won't have them in here," went on Alfred. "Outdoors or in, they gotta be with us," replied Stewart sharply.
"Listen, Al,"
came the booming of Stillwell's big voice.
"Now that we're butting in here with the girls, you let Stewart run things."
Then a crowd of men tramped out upon the porch. Stewart, dark-bowed and somber, was in the lead. Nels hung close to him, and Madeline's quick glance saw that Nels had undergone some indescribable change. The grinning, bright-eyed Don Carlo came jostling out beside a gaunt, sharp-featured man wearing a silver shield. This, no doubt, was Pat Haw. In the background, behind Stillwell and Alfred, stood Nick Steele, head and shoulders over a number of vaqueros and cowboys. "Miss Hammond, I'm sorry you came," said Stewart bluntly. "We're in a bit of a muddle here. I've insisted that you and Flo be kept close to us. I'll explain later. If you can't stop your ears, I beg you to overlook some rough talk." With that, he turned to the men behind him. Nick, take Booley. Go back to Monty and the boys. Go get 'em. Fetch out that stuff, all of it. Go on now. Stillwell and Alfred disengaged themselves from the crowd to take up positions in front of Madeline and Florence. Pat Haw leaned against a post and ogled Madeline and then Florence. Don Carlos pressed forward, his whole figure filling Madeline's reluctant but fascinating eyes. He wore tight velveteen breeches with a heavy fold down the outside seam, which was ornamented with silver buttons. Round about his waist was a sash and a belt with a fringed holster, from which protruded a pearl-handled gun. A vest or a waistcoat, richly embroidered, partially concealing a blouse of silk, wholly revealing a silken scarf round his neck. His swarthy face showed dark lines like cords under the surface. His little eyes were exceedingly poignant and glittering. To Madeline his face seemed to be a bold, handsome mask through which his eyes pierced, betraying the evil nature of the man. He bowed low with elaborate and sinuous grace. His smile revealed brilliant teeth, enhancing the brilliance of his eyes. He slowly spread his hands. "Senoritas, I beg 1,000 pardons," he said. How strange it was for Madeline to hear English spoken in such a soft, whiny, sweet accent. The gracious hospitality of Don Carlos has passed with his house. Stewart stepped forward and thrust Don Carlos aside. He called, "Make way there." The crowd fell back to the tramp of heavy boots. Cowboys appeared, staggering out of the corridor with long boxes. These they placed side by side upon the floor of the porch. "Now, Haw, we'll proceed with our business," said Stewart. "You see them boxes, don't you?" "I reckon I see a good many things round here," replied Haw meaningfully. "Well, do you intend to open these boxes upon my say-so?" "No," retorted Haw. "It's not my place to meddle with property as it come by express and an accounting for being regular." "You call yourself a sheriff," exclaimed Stewart scornfully. "Well, maybe you'll think so before long," rejoined Haw sullenly. "I'll open them then. Here, one of you boys knock the tops off these boxes," ordered Stewart. "No, not you, Monty. You use your eyes. Let Booley handle the axe. Go on now." Monty Pierce had jumped out of the crowd into the middle of the porch. The manner in which he gave way to Booley and faced the vaqueros was not significant of friendliness or trust. "Stewart, you're dead wrong to bust open them boxes. That's agin the law," protested Haw, trying to interfere. Stewart pushed him back. Then Don Carlos, who had been stunned by the appearance of the boxes, suddenly became active in speech and person. Stewart thrust him back also. The Mexican's excitement increased. He gestured wildly, and his expressions and exclaims in Spanish. When, however, the lids were wrenched open and inside packing torn away, he grew rigid and silent. Madeline raised herself behind Stillwell to see that the boxes were full of rifles and ammunition. "There you are, Haw. What did I tell you?" demanded Stewart. "I came over here to take charge of this ranch, and I found these boxes hidden in an unused room. I suspected what they were, contraband goods." "Well, suppose they are. I don't see any call for such all-fired fuss you're making, Stewart. I can tell you're something stuck on your new job and want to make a big show before—" "Haw, stop slinging that kind of talk," interrupted Stewart. "You got too free with your mouth once before. Now here I'm supposed to be consulting an officer of the law. Will you take charge of these contraband goods?"
"Say, you're holding on pretty high and mighty," replied Haw in astonishment that was plainly pretend. "What are you driving at?"
Stewart muttered. He took several swift strides across the porch. He held out his hands to Stillwell, as if to indicate the hopelessness of intelligence and reasonable arbitration. He looked at Madeline with a glance eloquent of his regret that he could not handle the situation to please her. Then he wheeled and came face to face with Niels, who had slipped forward out of the crowd. Madeline gathered serious import from the steel blue meaning that flashed on the eyes whereby Niels communicated something to Stewart. Whatever that something was, it dispelled Stewart's impatience. A slight movement of his hand brought Monty Price forward with a jump. In these sudden jumps of Monty's there was a suggestion of restrained ferocity. Then Nels and Monty lined up behind Stewart. It was a deliberate action, even to Madeline, unmistakably formidable. Pat Haw's face took on an ugly look. His eyes had a reddish gleam. Don Carlos added a pale face and extreme nervousness to his former expressions of agitation. The cowboys edged away from the vaqueros and the bronze-bearded horsemen, who were evidently Haw's assistants. "I'm driving at this," spoke up Stewart presently. Now he was slow and caustic. "Here's contraband of war. Haw, do you understand that? Arms and ammunition for the rebels across the border. I charge you as an officer to confiscate these goods and arrest the smuggler, Don Carlos." These words of Stewart's precipitated a riot among Don Carlo and his followers, and they surged wildly around the sheriff. There was an upflinging of brown and clenched hands, a shrill jabbering babble of Mexican voices. The crowd around Don Carlo grew louder and denser with the addition of armed vaqueros and barefooted stable boys and dusty-booted herdsmen and blanketed Mexicans, the last of whom suddenly slipped from doors, windows, and round corners. It was a motley assembly. The laced and fringed and ornamental vaqueros presented a sharp contrast to the bare-legged, sandal-footed boys and the ragged herders. Shrill voices, evidently from Don Carlos, somewhat quieted the commotion, and then Don Carlos could be heard addressing Sheriff Haw in an exhortation of mingled English and Spanish. He denied, he avowed, he proclaimed, and all in rapid, passionate utterances. He tossed his black hair in vehemence, and he waved his fists and stamped the floor. He rolled his glittering eyes. He twisted his thin lips into 100 different shapes, and like a cornered wolf, showed snarling white teeth. It seemed to Madeline that Don Carlos denied knowledge of the boxes of contraband goods, then knowledge of their real contents, and then knowledge of their destination, and finally everything except that they were in their sight, damning witnesses to somebody's complicity in the breaking of natural laws. Passionate as had been his denial of all this, it was nothing compared to his denouncing of Stewart. "Senor Stewart, he killed my vaqueros," shouted Don Carlos, as sweating and spent, he concluded his arraignment of the cowboy. "Him you must arrest. Senor Stewart's a bad man. He killed my vaqueros." "You hear that?" yelled Haw. "The Don's got you figured for that little job in El Cajon last fall." The clamor burst into a roar. Haw began shaking his finger in Stewart's face and hoarsely shouting. Then a lithe young vaquero, swift as an Indian, glided under Haw's uplifted arm. Whatever the action he intended, he was too late for its execution. Stewart lunged out and struck the vaquero, knocking him off the porch. As he fell, a derringer glittered in the sunlight, rolled clinking over the stones. The man went down hard and did not move. With the same abrupt violence and manner of contempt, Stewart threw Haw off the porch. Then Don Carlos, who was being less supple, fell heavily. Then the mob backed from Stewart's rush until all were down in the courtyard. The shuffling of feet ceased, and the clicking of spurs and the shouting. Niels and Monty, now reinforced by Nick Steele, were as shadows of Stewart. So closely they followed him. Stewart waved them back and stepped down into the yard. He was absolutely fearless, but what struck Madeline so keenly was his magnificent disdain. Magnificently he knew the nature of men with whom he was dealing. From the look of them, it was natural for Madeline to expect them to give way before him, which they did. Even Haw and his attendants suddenly retreated. Don Carlos got up to confront Stewart. The prostrate vaquero stirred, moaning, but did not rise. "You needn't gibber Spanish to me," said Stewart. "You can talk American, and you can understand American. If you start a rough house here, you and your greasers will be cleaned up. You've got to leave this ranch. You can have the stock, the packs, and traps in the second corral. There's grub too. Saddle up and hit the trail. Don Carlos, I'm dealing more than square with you. You're lying about those boxes of guns and cartridges. You're breaking the laws of my country, and you're doing it on property that's in my charge. If I let smuggling go on here, I'll be implicating myself. Now you get off the range. If you don't, I'll have the United States Cavalry in 6 hours, and you can gamble they'll get what my cowboys leave of you." Don Carlos was either a capital actor, or gratefully relieved at Stewart's leniency, or else he was thoroughly cowed by reference of the troops. "Si, senor. Gracias, senor," he exclaimed, and then, turning away, he called to his men. They hurried after him, while the fallen vaquero got to his feet with Stewart's help and staggered across the courtyard. In a moment they were gone, leaving Haw and his several compadres behind. Haw was spitefully ejecting a wad of tobacco from his mouth and swearing in an undertone about white-livered greasers, and he cocked his eye at Stewart. "Well, I reckon you're so hell-bent on doing it up brown that you're trying to fire me off the range, too." "If I ever do it, Pat, you'll need to be carried off," replied Stewart. "Just now I'm politely inviting you and your deputy sheriffs to leave." "We'll go, but we're coming back one of these days, and when we do, we'll be putting you in irons." "Haw, if you got it that bad for me, come over here in the corral and let's fight it out." "I'm an officer, and I don't fight outlaws and such except when I have to make arrests." "Officer, you're a disgrace to the county. If you ever did get irons on me, you'd take me someplace out of sight and shoot me, and then swear you killed me in self-defense. It wouldn't be the first time you pulled that trick, Pat Haw." "Ha ha!" laughed Haw derisively. Then he stared towards the horses. Stewart's long arm shot out, his hand clapping on Haw's shoulder, spinning him around like a top. "You're leaving, Pat, but before you leave, you'll come out with your play or you'll crawl," said Stewart. "You got it in for me, man to man. Speak up now and prove you're not the cowardly skunk I've always thought you were. I'm calling your hand." Pat Haw's face turned a blackish purple hue. "I can just bet that I've got it in for you," he shouted hoarsely. "You're only a low-down cow-puncher. You never had a dollar or a decent job till you mixed up with our Hammond woman." Stewart's hand flashed out and hit Haw in the face with a ringing slap. The sheriff's head jerked back, his sombrero falling to the ground. As he reached over and bent for it, his hand shook, his arm shook, and his whole body shook. Monty Price jumped forward, crouching down with a strange and low cry. Stewart seemed all at once rigid, bending a little. "The name is Miss Hammond, if there is an occasion to use her name," said Stewart, in a voice that seemed coolly pleasant, yet there was a deadly undertone. Haw did a moment's battle with a strangling fury, which he conquered in some measure. "I said you was a low-down drunken cow-puncher, as tough as damn near desperado as we ever had on the border," went on Haw deliberately. His speech appeared to be addressing Stewart, although his flame-pointed eyes were riveted upon Monty Price. "I know you plugged that vaquero last fall, and when I get my proof, I'm coming after you." "That's all right, Haw. You can call me what you like, and you can come after me whenever you like," replied Stewart. "But you're going to be getting in bad with me. You're in bad now with Monty and Nils. Pretty soon you'll queer yourself in with all the cowboys and the ranchers, too. If that don't put some sense into you. Here, listen to this. You knew what those boxes contained. You know Don Carlos has been smuggling arms and ammunition across the border. You know he is hand in glove with rebels. You've been wearing blinders, and it's been in your interest. You best take a hunch from me. That's all. Light out now, and the less we see of your handsome mug, the better we'll like you." Muttering, cursing, Haw climbed astride his horse. His comrades followed suit. Certain it appeared that the sheriff was contending with more than fear and wrath. He must have had an irresistible impulse to fling more threats upon Stewart, but he was speechless. Savagely he spurred his horse, and as it snorted and leapt, he turned in his saddle, shaking his fist. His comrades led the way, with their horses clattering into a canter. They disappeared through the gate. When later in the day Madeline and Florence, accompanied by Alfred and Stillwell, left Don Carlos' ranch, it was not any too soon for Madeline. The inside of the Mexican's house was more unprepossessing and uncomfortable than the outside. The halls were dark, and the rooms huge, empty, and musty, and there was an air of silence and secrecy and mystery about them most fitting to the character Florence had bestowed upon the place. On the other hand, Alfred's ranch house, where the party halted to spend the night, was picturesque and located and small and cozy, camp-like in its arrangements, and altogether agreeable to Madeline. The day's long rides and the exciting events had wearied her. She rested while Florence and the two men got supper. During the meal, Stillwell expressed satisfaction over the good riddance of the vaqueros, and with his usual optimism trusted that he had seen the last of them. Alfred, too, took a decidedly favorable view of the day's proceedings. However, it was not lost upon Madeline that Florence appeared unusually quiet and thoughtful. Madeline wondered a little at the cause. She remembered that Stewart had wanted them to come with them, or detail a few cowboys to accompany them, but Alfred had laughed at the idea and would have none of it. After supper, Alfred monopolized the conversation by describing what he wanted to do to improve his home before he and Florence were married. And then, at an early hour, they all retired. Madeline's deep slumbers were disturbed by a pounding upon the wall, and then by Florence's crying out in answer to the call. "Get up, throw some clothes on, and come on out." It was Alfred's voice.
"What's the matter?"
asked Florence as she slipped out of bed.
"Alfred, is there something wrong?"
Madeline sitting up. The room was dark as pitch, but a faint glow seemed to mark the position of the window. "Oh, nothing much," replied Alfred. Just Don Carlos ranch going up in smoke."
"Fire!" cried Florence sharply.
"You'll think so when you see it. Hurry up, Majesty, old girl. No, you won't have to tear down that heap of adobes you so threatened. I don't think a wall will stand after that fire."
"Well, I'm glad of it," said Madeline. "A good healthy fire will purify the atmosphere over there and save me the expense. That haunted ranch gave me the nerves. Florence, I do believe you've appropriated part of my riding habit. Doesn't Alfred have lights in this house?"
Florence laughingly helped Madeline to dress, and then they hurriedly stumbled over chairs and passed through the dining room, went out onto the porch. Away to the westward, low down along the horizon, she saw leaping red flames and wind-swept columns of smoke. Stillwell appeared greatly perturbed.
"Al, I'm looking for that ammunition to blow up," he said. "There was surely enough of it to blow the roof off that ranch."
"Bill, surely the cowboys would get that stuff out of there first thing," replied Alfred.
"Well, I reckon so, but all the same, I'd be worrying. Maybe there wasn't time. Suppose that powder went off as the boys was going for it or for carrying it out. We'll know soon, though. If the explosion doesn't come quick now, we can figure the boys got the boxes out."
For the next few moments there was a silence of sustained and painful suspense. Florence gripped Madeline's arm. Madeline felt a fullness in her throat and a rapid beating of her heart. Presently she was relieved with the others when Stillwell declared the danger of an explosion needed to be feared no longer.
"Well, you sure can gamble on Jane Stewart," he added.
The night happened to be partially cloudy with broken rifts along the moon. The wind blew unusually strong. The brightness of the fire seemed subdued. It was like a huge bonfire smothered by some great covering, penetrated by different, widely separated points of flame. These corners of flames flew up and curled in the wind and then died down. Thus the scene was constantly changing from dull light to dark. There came a moment when a blacker shade overspread the wide area of flickering gleams, then obscured them. Night enfolded the scene. The moon peeped a curved yellow rim from under broken clouds. To all appearances the fire had burned itself out. But suddenly a pinpoint of light showed where all had been dense black. It grew and became long and sharp. It moved. It had life. It leapt up, its color warming from white to red. And then, from all about it, burst flame upon flame, to leap into a great channeling pillar of fire that climbed higher and higher. Huge tunnels of smoke, yellow, black, white, all tinged with the color of fire, slanting skywards, drifting away on the wind.
"Well, I reckon we won't have the good of them 2,000 tons of alfalfa we was figuring on," remarked Stillwell.
"Ah, then that's the last outbreak of fire was burning hay," said Madeline. "I do not regret the ranch, but it's too bad to lose such quality of good feed for the stock."
"It's lost, and no mistake. The fire's dying as quick as she flared up. Well, I hope none of the boys got risky to save a saddle or a blanket. Monty, he's hell on running the gauntlet with fire. He's like a horse that just been dragged out of a burning stable and runs back sure locoed up. There, she's smoldering down again. Reckon we all might just as well turn in again. It's only 3 o'clock.
"I wonder how that fire got started," remarked Alfred. "Some careless cowboy's cigarette, I bet." Stillwell rolled out his laughter.
Ah, you sure are a free-hearted, trusting feller. I'm sure no doubting the cigarette idea, but you can gamble it was a cigarette belonging to a cunning vaquero, and wasn't dropped by accident.
Now, Bill, you don't mean Don Carlos burned the ranch himself? Ejected Alfred in a mingle of amazement and anger. Again, the old cattleman laughed.
Powerful strange to say, my friend. Old Bill means just that.
Of course, Don Carlos set that fire, put in Florence with spirit. Al, if you lived out here 100 years, you'd never learn that greasers are treacherous. I know Gene Stewart was suspecting something underhand. That's why he wanted us to hurry away. And that's why he put me on that black horse of Don Carlos. He wants that horse for himself and feared the Don would steal or shoot him. And you and Bill Stewart, you're as bad as Al. You never distrust anyone till it's too late. You've been singing ever since Stewart ordered the vaqueros off the range, but you sure haven't been thinking.
Well, now, Flo, you needn't pitch me into me just because I have a natural Christian spirit, replied Stillwell. I reckon I've had enough trouble in my life so's not to go looking for more. Well, I'm sorry about the hay burning, but maybe the boys saved the stock. And as for the old adobe house of dark holes and underground passages, so long as Miss Majesty don't mind, I'm darn glad it burned. Come on now, let's all turn in again. Somebody ride over early and tell us what's going on.
Madeline awoke early, but not so early as the others, who were up and having breakfast ready when she went into the dining room. Stillwell was not in a middle frame of mind. The furrows of worry lined his broad brow, and he continually glanced at his watch and growled because the cowboys were so late in riding over with the news. He gulped his breakfast, and while Madeline and the others ate theirs, he tramped up and down the porch. Madeline noted that Alfred grew nervous and restless. Presently he left the table to join Stillwell outside.
They'll slope off to Don Carlos' ranch and leave us to ride home alone, observed Florence. Did you mind? Questioned Madeline. No, I don't exactly mind. We've got the fastest horses in the county, and I'd like to run that big black devil off his legs. No, I don't mind, but I've no hankering for a situation Gene Stewart thinks.
Florence began disconnectingly, and she ended evasively. Madeline did not press the point, although she had some sense of misgiving. Stillwell tramped in, shaking the floor with his huge boots. Alfred followed him, carrying a field glass.
Not a hoss in sight, complained Stillwell. Something's wrong over at Don Carlos' way. Miss Majesty, it'll be just as well for you and Flo to hit the trail home. We can telephone over and see the boys know that you're coming.
Alfred, standing in the door, swept the gray valley with his field glass. Bill, I see running saddle stock or cattle. I can't make out which. I guess we better hustle on over there. Both men hurried out, and while the horses were being brought up and saddled, Madeline and Florence put away the breakfast dishes, then speedily donned spurs, sombreros, and gauntlets. Here are the horses ready, called Alfred. Flo, that black Mexican horse is a prince. The girls went out in time to hear Stillwell's goodbye as he mounted and spurred away. Alfred went through the motions of assisting Madeline and Florence to mount, which assistance they always flouted, and then he too swung up astride. I guess it's all right, he said rather dubiously. You really must not go over to Don Carlos. It's only a few miles home.
Sure, it's all right. We can ride, can't we? Retorted Florence. Better have a care for yourself, going off over there to mix in goodness knows what.
Alfred bid them goodbye and spurred his horse, rode away.
"If Bill doesn't forget to telephone," exclaimed Florence, "I declare he and Al are sure rattled."
Florence dismounted and went to the house. She left the door open. Madeline had some difficulty in holding Majesty. It struck Madeline that Florence stayed rather long indoors. Presently she came out with a somber face and rather tight lips.
"I couldn't get anyone on the phone. There's no answer. I tried a dozen times."
"Why, Florence?" Madeline was more concerned by the girl's looks than the information she imparted.
"The wire's been cut," said Florence.
Her grey glance swept swiftly after Alfred, who was now out of earshot.
"I don't like this any at all. Here's where I got a figure, as Bill would say."
She pondered a moment, then hurried into the house, to return presently with the field glass that Alfred had used. With this she took survey of the valley, particularly in the direction of Madeline's ranch house. This was hidden by low, rolling ridges, which were close by.
"Anyway, nobody in that direction can see us leave here," she mused. "There's mesquite on the ridges. We've got cover long enough to save us till we can see what's expected up ahead." "Florence, what do you expect?"
asked Madeline nervously.
"I don't know. There's never any telling about greasers. I wish Bill and Al hadn't left us. Still, come to think of that, they couldn't help us much in a case of a chase. We'll run right away from them. Besides, they'd shoot. I guess I'm as well as satisfied that we got the job of getting home on our own hands. We didn't dare follow Al towards Don Carlos' ranch. We know there's trouble over there. So now all that's left is to hit the trail for home. Come on, let's ride. You stick like a Spanish needle to me."
A heavy growth of mesquite covered the top of the first ridge, and the trail went through it. Florence took the lead, proceeding cautiously, and as soon as she could see over the summit she used the field glass. Then she went on. Madeline followed closely, saw down the slope of the ridge to a bare, wide, grassy hollow, and onward to more rolling land thick with cactus and mesquite. Florence appeared cautious, deliberate, yet she lost no time. She was always alert. Madeline's misgivings took a definite shape in the fear of vaqueros in ambush. Upon the ascent of the third ridge, which Madeline remembered was the last uneven ground between the point she had reached and home, Florence exercised even more guarded care in advancing. Before she reached the top of the ridge, she dismounted, looped her bridle round a dead snag, and motioned Madeline to wait. She slipped ahead through the mesquite out of sight. Madeline waited, anxiously listening and watching. Certain it was that she could not see or hear anything alarming. The sun began to have a touch of heat. The morning breeze rustled the thin mesquite foliage, and the deep magenta of the cactus flower caught her eye. A long-tailed, cruel-beaked brown bird sailed so close to her she could have touched it with her whip. But she was only vaguely aware of these things. She was watching for Florence, listening for some sound fraught with untoward meaning. All of a sudden, she saw Majesty's ears come held straight up, and then Florence's face, now strangely white, showing round the turn of the trail. "Shh!" whispered Florence, holding up a warning finger. She reached the black horse and petted him, evidently to still an uneasiness he was manifesting. "We're in for it," she went on. "A whole bunch of vaqueros are hiding among the mesquite over the ridge. They've not seen or heard us yet. We better risk riding ahead and cut off the trail and beat them to the ranch. Madeline, you're white as death. Don't faint now."
I shall not faint, but you frighten me. Is there danger? What shall we do? There is danger. I wouldn't deceive you, went on Florence in an earnest whisper. Things have turned out just as Jean Stewart hinted. Al should have listened to Jean. I'm afraid Jean knew. Knew what? Asked Madeline. Never mind now, listen. We daren't take the back trail. We'll go on. I have a scheme to fool that grinning Don Carlos. Get down, Madeline. Hurry.
Madeline dismounted.
Give me your white sweater. Take it off, and that white hat. Hurry, Madeline. Florence, what on earth do you mean?
Cried Madeline.
Not so loud,
whispered the other. Her gray eyes snapped. She was divesting herself of sombrero and jacket which she held out to Madeline.
Here, take these and give me yours, and then get up on the black. All right, Majesty. Rustle now, Madeline. This is no time to talk. Why, dear, why do you want? Oh, you're gonna make the vaqueros take you from me. You guessed it, will you? I shall not allow you to do anything of the kind, returned Madeline. It was then that Florence's face changed, took on a hard, stern sharpness so typical of the cowboys. Madeline had caught glimpses of that expression in Alfred's face, and on Stewart's when he was silent, and on Stillwell's always. It had a look of iron and fire, unchangeable, unquenching will. There was even more of violence in the swift action whereby Florence compelled Madeline to the change of apparel. It's been my idea anyhow, if Stewart hadn't told me to do it, said Florence. Her words were as swift as her hands. Don Carlos is after you, Miss Madeline Hammond. He wouldn't ambush a trail for anyone else. He's not killing cowboys these days. He wants you for some reason. Jean thought, and now I believe him. Well, we'll know for sure in a few minutes. You ride the black, I'll ride Majesty. We'll slip around through the brush, out of sight and sound, until we break out into the open, and then we'll split. You make straight for the ranch. I'll cut loose for the valley where Jean said positively the cowboys were with the cattle. The vaqueros will take me for you. They all know those striking white things you wear, and they'll chase me. They'll never get anywhere near me, and you'll be on a fast horse as well. He can take you home ahead of any vaqueros, but you shouldn't be chased. I'm staking all on that. Trust me, Madeline. If it was only my calculations, maybe it's because I remember Stewart. That cowboy knows things. Come, this here's the safest, smartest thing to fool Don Carlos.
Madeline felt herself more forced than persuaded into obedience. She mounted the black and took up the bridle. In another moment she was gliding her horse off the trail in the tracks of Majesty. Florence led off at right angles, threading a slow passage through the mesquites. She favored sandy patches and open aisles between the trees, and was careful not to break a branch. Often she stopped to listen. This detour of perhaps half a mile brought Madeline to where she could see open ground, the ranch house only a few miles off, and the cattle dotting the valley. She had not lost her courage, but it was certain that these familiar sights somehow lightened the pressure upon her breast. Excitement gripped her. The shrill whistle of a horse made both the black and the Majesty jump. Florence quickened the gait down the slope, and soon Madeline saw the edge of the brush, the gray, bleached grass, and level ground. Florence waited at the opening between the low trees. She gave Madeline a quick, bright glance. It's all over but ride. That'll be easy. Bolt now and keep your nerve. When Florence wheeled the fiery roan and screamed in his ear, Madeline suddenly began to grow lax and helpless. The big horse leapt into thundering action.
This was memorable of Benita and the flying hare and the wild night ride. Florence's hair streamed on the wind and shone gold in the sunlight. Yet Madeline saw her with the same thrill with which she had seen the wild riding Benita. And then hoarse shouts unclamped Madeline's power of movement, and she spurred the black into the open. He wanted to run, and he was swift. Madeline loosened the reins, laid them loose upon his neck. His actions was strange to her. He was hard to ride, but he was fast, and she cared for nothing else. Madeline knew horses well enough to realize that the black had found he was free and carrying a light weight. A few times she took up the bridle and pulled to the right or left, trying to guide him. He kept a straight course, however, crashing through small patches of mesquite and jumping the creeks and washes. Uneven ground offered no perception obstacle to his running. To Madeline, there was only now a thrilling difference in the lashing of wind and flash of grey ground underneath. She was running away from something. What that was she did not know, but she remembered Florence, and she wanted to look back, yet hated to do so for fear of the nameless danger Florence had mentioned. Madeline listened for the pounding of pursuing hooves on her rear. Involuntarily she looked back. On the mile or more of grey level between her and the ridge, there was not a horse, a man, or anything living. She wheeled to look back at the other side down the valley slope. The sight of Florence riding majesty in a zigzag flight before a whole troop of vaqueros whitened Madeline's cheeks and made her grip the pommel of her saddle in terror. That strange gait of her roan was not his wonderful stride. Could Majesty be running wild? Madeline saw one vaquero draw close, whirling his lasso around his head, but he did not get close enough to throw. So it seemed to Madeline. Another vaquero swept across in front of the first, and then when Madeline gasped in breathless expectancy, the roan swerved to evade the attack. It flashed over Madeline that Florence was putting the horse to some awkward flight, as might have been expected of an Eastern girl frightened out of her wits. Madeline made sure of this when, after looking again, she saw that Florence, in spite of the horse's breaking gait and irregular course, was drawing slowly but surely down the valley. Madeline had not lost her head to the extent of forgetting her own mount and the nature of the ground in front. When presently she turned and again to watch Florence, uncertainty ceased in her mind. The strange features of that race between girl and vaqueros was no longer in evidence. Majesty was in his beautiful, wonderful stride, low down along the ground, stretching with his nose level and straight for the valley. Between him and the lean horses in pursuit lay an ever-increasing space. He was running away from the vaqueros. Florence was indeed riding the wind. A steward had aptly expressed his idea of flight upon the fleet roan. A dimness grew over Madeline's eyes, and it was not at all owing to the stinging of the wind. She rubbed it away, seeing Florence as a flying dot in a strange blur. What a daring, intrepid girl. This kind of strength and splendid thought of a weaker sister was what the West eluded in a woman. The next time Madeline looked back, Florence was far ahead of her pursuers and going out of sight behind a low knoll. Assured of Florence's safety, Madeline put her mind to her own ride and the possibilities awaiting at the ranch. She remembered the failure to get any of her servants or cowboys on telephone. To be sure, a windstorm had once broken the wire, but she had no real hope of such being the case in this instant. She rode on, pulling the black as she neared the ranch. Her approach was from the south and off the usual trail, so she went up the long slope of the knoll towards the back of the house. Under these circumstances, she could not consider it out of the ordinary that she did not see anyone out on the grounds. It was perhaps fortunate for her, she thought, that the climb up the slope cut the black's speed so she could manage him. He was not very hard to stop. The moment she dismounted, however, he jumped and trotted off. At the edge of the slope, facing the corrals, he halted and lifted his head and shot up his ears. Then he let out a piercing whistle and dashed down the lane. Madeline, prepared by that warning whistle, tried to fort herself for a new and unexpected situation. But as she seen an unfamiliar company of horsemen rapidly riding down a hollow leading from the foothills, she felt the return of fears gripping at her like cold hands, and she fled into the house. End of chapter 10.